Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. They say trust is the foundation of any marriage, but nobody tells you what to do when that foundation begins to crumble. For years, I thought my marriage was built on something unshakable. My wife, Claire, and I had been together for more than a decade. We had our routines, our shared memories, the inside jokes that only we understood. There were late-night talks, vacations, and plans that stretched into the distant future. It wasn't always perfect, but it was ours. Yet, somewhere along the way, things changed. It was gradual at first, so slow that I barely noticed. She started working late more often, claiming her job was getting more demanding. I didn't question it at first. I knew how much she cared about her career and had always been her biggest supporter. But there were signs that, in hindsight, I should have paid more attention to. Her appearance changed, for one. Claire always looked put together, but now she seemed to put extra effort into her looks, especially on the nights she had to stay late at work. It was subtle, just an extra spritz of perfume or a new blouse she just had to have for a client meeting. At first, I thought it was harmless. Who doesn't like to look good for work? But the changes in her demeanor were harder to ignore. She was distracted, her laughter was more guarded, and she was glued to her phone like it was her lifeline. Then came the night that everything changed. She had come home late, as usual, and barely looked at me when she walked through the door. Her phone chimed with a notification, and she snatched it up so fast you'd think it was burning a hole in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, smiled slightly, and then tucked it away. It was a small gesture, but it hit me like a sledgehammer. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was nothing. But the gnawing suspicion wouldn't let go. So, one night when she left her phone unattended, I broke my own rule. I never thought I'd be the guy who would check his wife's phone, but there I was, holding it with my hands trembling as I swiped through her messages. That's when I found them, the messages between her and someone named Nick. At first, it was just friendly, but as I scrolled further, the texts became more intimate. They were making plans, talking about us and our time together. My heart felt like it had been ripped out of my chest. It wasn't just one or two messages, it was a pattern, a whole separate life that she'd carved out for herself without me. I stayed up all night that night, sitting alone in the darkened living room, replaying every moment of our marriage in my head. The late nights, the extra time she spent on her phone, the faint smell of cologne on her clothes that I knew wasn't mine. It all started to add up, every piece falling into place like a grotesque puzzle. The next morning, I decided to confront her. I waited until she was fully awake, cup of coffee in hand, before I said anything. I told her I knew about Nick, that I had seen the messages. Her face drained of color. She tried to deny it at first, saying I was overreacting, that it was just innocent texting. But I could see in her eyes that she knew the truth was out. Then, in a twist that I hadn't expected, she admitted it. She told me she had been seeing Nick for months. She claimed she still loved me, but that she needed something more. And then she had the audacity to suggest we try an open relationship. She said that maybe monogamy wasn't for her and that she thought I was strong enough to handle it. Her words felt like ice water pouring over my head. It was as if I was nothing more than a convenient part of her life, someone who would go along with anything just to keep the peace. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just sat there, listening to her justify the betrayal, as though it was a business decision she'd made to improve her happiness. She had already rationalized every angle, preparing arguments about how everyone else was doing it, how marriage didn't mean ownership, and how she'd be even more attentive to me if I let her have this freedom. Each word drove me deeper into my silence, my anger, and my resolve. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't fight her outright. Instead, I'd let her think she was winning, that I was actually considering her proposition. But deep down, I knew what I had to do. If she wanted freedom, I'd give it to her. But it would be on my terms, not hers. The first thing I did was gather all the evidence I could find. I copied every message between her and Nick, all the meeting times and places they'd talked about. I made notes on her schedule, mentally cataloging the nights she claimed she was working late. I even checked our bank accounts for any unusual expenses, and sure enough, I found charges for dinners and gifts that didn't make sense for someone who was supposedly working overtime. I played my part well, acting like the supportive, open-minded husband. I agreed to talk about her ideas, to listen to her reasons for wanting something more. I could see her relaxing, believing she had managed to talk her way out of it. But every time she went out, every time she claimed she was going to meet friends, or stay late at work, I'd make a note, quietly adding to the growing pile of evidence. Meanwhile, I began to secure everything on the financial front. Our joint accounts became a target for my quiet maneuvering. I set up separate accounts, moved funds discreetly, and ensured that if things went south, I wouldn't be the one left scrambling. She didn't even notice the changes, too busy with her newfound freedom to realize that I was already laying the groundwork for my exit. The hardest part was the waiting. Acting normal around her, pretending to be interested in her stories, laughing at jokes that now felt hollow. But I knew that the longer I waited, the stronger my position would be. Every extra day gave me more time to fortify my defenses, to prepare for the day when I'd make my move. Weeks went by, and she grew bolder. She stopped making excuses, telling me openly that she was going out with friends. Each time, she came back looking happier, more relaxed, like she had gotten what she wanted and no longer had to worry about keeping up appearances. Finally, when I had gathered every piece of evidence, every bank statement, every text message, I was ready. The confrontation that was coming would be different from the one she expected. She thought she'd tamed me, convinced me to play along. But what she didn't realize was that I had played along for my own reasons. I was no longer the husband she thought she could control. When the day came, I didn't even need to say much. She came home to find that her keys didn't fit the lock. There was no yelling, no dramatic scene. Just a letter taped to the door explaining everything in simple terms. I'd filed for divorce, taken care of all the legal arrangements, and ensured that our assets were divided in a way that would leave her with exactly what she'd earned, nothing more than the consequences of her choices. As I walked away from the house that had once been our shared dream, I felt a strange sense of peace. I'd given her what she wanted, her freedom. But it came at a price she hadn't expected. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. It's hard to describe the calm that settled over me after I locked her out that night. Months of planning, hiding, and playing the part of the dutiful, supportive husband had finally come to an end. I'd watched her sail through our home and our lives with that newfound confidence, thinking she'd found the perfect arrangement. She believed she was in control, and I let her think that way until the moment I locked the door. When she arrived home and found herself standing outside with nowhere to go, I imagined the realization hitting her like a wave. Claire wasn't used to facing consequences, especially when she could charm her way around them. She'd always prided herself on being the kind of person who could talk anyone into her version of reality. I'd watched her do it with her bosses, our friends, even her own family when she wanted them to see things her way. But now, she was left facing something she couldn't manipulate her way out of. She had always thought she could win anyone over, but there was no more winning here. That night, I stayed with a friend. It was the first time I'd been able to tell someone the truth about what had been happening. Tom was one of those rare friends who wouldn't pry, wouldn't judge. He had known something was up for a while but had respected my silence. As I walked into his house, he took one look at my face and simply handed me a beer without a word. We sat on his back porch in the fading evening light, sipping our beers in a quiet that felt healing. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low and steady. "So, it's done." I nodded, taking another swig. "She's out, and I'm out. Locked her out tonight." Tom let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Can't say I didn't see something coming. But this? Hell of a move, man. It's the only one I had left, I said, my voice almost a whisper, realizing that for the first time, I wasn't keeping secrets. She was playing me for months, Tom. Thought she had me right where she wanted me. But I couldn't just let it go on like that. Tom nodded, but his eyes stayed focused on me. So, what now? Divorce is already filed. I've secured everything important. She won't be able to come after anything that isn't rightfully hers. I felt the weight lift just saying it out loud. It's finally over. The next morning, I went back to the house to pick up a few last things. When I got there, I found Claire waiting outside, dressed impeccably despite the early hour. Her face was a mixture of anger and disbelief, and for a moment, I wondered if she thought she could still charm her way back in. As I walked up to the door, she blocked my path, her voice sharp and edged with desperation. "What is this, Derek?" she demanded. "What are you doing?" I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "This is the end, Claire. You wanted your freedom, and now you have it." Her expression shifted, a flicker of fear crossing her face before she masked it with anger. "Freedom? You think locking me out is freedom? You've lost your mind." I unlocked the door and stepped inside, leaving her standing outside. She followed me in, not ready to let go just yet. "This isn't over, Derek," she said, her voice cracking with frustration. "You can't just throw me out like some stranger." "I didn't throw you out, Claire. You chose this," I replied, refusing to raise my voice, keeping my tone calm and deliberate. "Every late night, every excuse, every time you lied to me, that was you making your choice." Her face flushed, and for a moment, I thought she'd try to argue, but she seemed to realize there was no point. "So that's it? You're just going to walk away from everything we've built together?" I looked around the room that had once been filled with our shared dreams, a place we had imagined building a future. But now, it felt empty, stripped of anything meaningful. "It stopped being ours a long time ago, Claire. You made sure of that." She dropped her eyes, the anger dissipating into something closer to regret. But I knew her too well to believe in any sudden change of heart. Claire was a survivor. She adapted when things didn't go her way, and right now, she was searching for a new angle. "So, what am I supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice softened, an almost practiced sadness taking over her features. "We've been together for so long. I don't even know where to start." "That's up to you," I said, shrugging. "You wanted freedom. You wanted more than this. So go find it." I packed my things in silence, ignoring her attempts to coax a reaction out of me. Finally, with everything in my car, I turned to her one last time. "Goodbye, Claire." As I drove away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't just about her betrayal, it was about finally breaking free from the version of myself that had spent so long trying to please her, to keep everything smooth and steady. I had been living in her shadow, always bending to fit her needs, her moods, her whims. But now, for the first time, I was stepping into my own life. In the days that followed, Claire tried reaching out, leaving voicemails filled with empty apologies and promises that she'd make it up to me. But I knew better. Her words felt as hollow as our marriage had become. She wanted me back only because she didn't want to face the reality of her choices. She didn't want to admit that she had gambled everything and lost. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding, slowly piecing together a life without her in it. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects, reconnecting with friends, and reclaiming parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of our marriage. The ache of betrayal was still there, but it dulled with time, replaced by a quiet determination to live a life that was mine alone. One afternoon, as I sat in my new apartment surrounded by boxes waiting to be unpacked, I received a call from Claire. This time, instead of the pleas and half-hearted apologies, she went straight to anger, accusing me of abandoning her, of destroying her life. I let her words wash over me, detached, unaffected. "You're the one who threw this away, Claire," I told her, my voice steady. "You chose to betray me. Don't pretend you're the victim now." The silence on the other end told me I'd finally broken through her last defense. She muttered something under her breath, then hung up. It was the last time I heard from her. In the weeks that followed, I learned more about myself than I had in years. I learned that I was stronger than I thought, that I didn't need someone else's validation to feel whole. I found solace in the quiet moments, in the simple routines that I created for myself. I started running again, something I hadn't done in years, finding clarity in the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the pavement. I began cooking meals I'd never tried, discovering that I enjoyed experimenting in the kitchen. Each small step was a reminder that I was rebuilding, not just my life but myself. The nights were still hard, though. There were moments when the silence felt too heavy, when I found myself wondering if I'd ever fully shake the shadow of betrayal. But each morning brought a new chance, a new piece of the life I was crafting on my own terms. One evening, I received an email from a mutual friend who had heard about the divorce. He said he'd seen Claire out with Nick, and that she looked miserable. It didn't surprise me. People like her often believe they're chasing happiness, only to find it was a mirage. But I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say, no need to revisit what was already past. I had my freedom back, and this time, I wasn't giving it up for anyone. Starting over came with a strange sense of freedom, one I hadn't felt in years. My new apartment was small but cozy, a blank slate with nothing to remind me of the life I'd just left behind. Each day, I put another part of that past out of mind. I built new routines, got lost in work, and reclaimed parts of myself that I'd set aside. But there was still the nagging echo of betrayal, and it lingered, sometimes coming back at the most unexpected times. One morning, I ran into Tom at a cafe, and he insisted on treating me to breakfast. We grabbed a table by the window, and as the conversation settled into easy laughter and coffee refills, he finally got around to what he'd been wanting to ask. "So, how does it feel, now that it's all behind you?" he asked, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "It feels strange. Like there's a weight that's gone, but sometimes I still feel it pressing on me, like a ghost," I said, not sure how else to describe it. "Some days are good. Some days, not so much." Tom nodded. "That's normal. You went through a lot. But you're doing good, man. Moving on and all." "Thanks, Tom," I replied, meaning it. He was one of the few who'd seen me at my lowest, but he never made me feel pitted or weak. He just listened. After breakfast, I headed to work and lost myself in a mountain of tasks. Work had become my sanctuary in a way it never was before. With Claire out of my life, I threw myself into every project, taking on extra assignments, staying late to work out every detail. My co-workers noticed, even joked about it. To them, I was just the guy on a mission. They didn't know the truth, didn't need to. But work was only a distraction, a temporary refuge from the quiet nights when my mind drifted back to the past. That's why, when I got the email from my lawyer confirming the finalization of the divorce, it hit me harder than I expected. It was official, on paper, in ink. I was no longer married to Claire, and that realization came with a cocktail of relief and a twinge of bitterness. 12 years gone, reduced to a file, a few signatures, and a stamp. That evening, as I sat alone with a drink in my hand, I let myself feel everything I'd been trying to push away, the anger, the disbelief, the sadness. She had been my partner, my confidant, my love. But she'd thrown it all away, and for what? A fleeting thrill with someone who probably meant as little to her as she did to him. Yet, as painful as it was, I knew that dwelling on it wouldn't help. So, I let myself feel it, then released it, deciding that tonight would be the last time I'd let her haunt me. I'd endured enough sleepless nights and questioning silences. It was time to finally live for myself. The next morning, with a renewed sense of purpose, I headed out early. I wanted to push myself, to keep moving forward. As I jogged through the neighborhood, the sun just beginning to rise, I felt lighter. The routine brought back a sense of control, a rhythm that calmed me. I focused on my breathing, each step hitting the pavement with a steady beat. Running had been something I loved before, something I'd stopped making time for after Claire and I had settled into our routines. Now, I was reclaiming it. That afternoon, I returned to the cafe where Tom and I had breakfast. I had my laptop with me, intending to get some work done. The place was busier than usual, filled with the hum of conversations and the clinking of coffee cups. I found a corner table, set up my things, and dived into my work. After an hour or so, I looked up from my screen, stretching my neck, and noticed a woman sitting at a nearby table, reading. She looked up at the same time, our eyes meeting for a brief moment. She smiled, and I smiled back, a small, polite exchange, nothing more. But as I returned to my work, I couldn't shake the sense that something was shifting. It was the first time in a long while that I'd felt anything close to curiosity about someone else. It was a quiet reminder that, maybe, the world was still full of possibilities I hadn't considered. Days turned into weeks, and gradually, I started to notice the small ways I was changing. I laughed more freely, felt less weighed down by the anger and resentment. I began spending more time with friends, going out for drinks or dinner, exploring the city, and slowly building a life that felt like my own. The woman from the cafe became a regular fixture, always with a different book in her hand, always with a calm, contented look on her face. I never spoke to her, never did more than share a polite nod, but she seemed to embody something I was trying to reach, a quiet peace, a self-assuredness. One day, Tom invited me to a small gathering at his place. It was a casual get-together, just a few close friends and their spouses. As I walked in, a strange pang of discomfort settled in my chest. It was the first time I'd been around so many couples since the divorce, and I felt oddly out of place. Watching them laugh together, share small glances, I felt like I was seeing something I'd lost a long time ago. But Tom, ever the perceptive friend, picked up on my mood. He nudged me with his shoulder, handing me a drink. "Hey, don't get lost in your head," he said, smiling. "You're here, with us. You're good, man." I nodded, grateful for his support. I joined in the conversations, shared a few stories, and as the night went on, I started to relax. I realized that I didn't need to compare my life to anyone else's. I was on my own path, and that was okay. As the gathering wound down, I found myself in a quiet moment with Tom, the others deep in conversation around the fire pit. He looked at me, his expression softening. "You know," he began, "I never said it, but I'm proud of you. You handled it all with more grace than most people would." I chuckled, shaking my head. Grace isn't exactly the word I'd use. "Trust me," he said, patting me on the back. "You're stronger than you think. And you're only getting started." The words stuck with me, echoing in my mind as I drove home. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was just the beginning of something new, something I hadn't expected but needed. Later that week, I returned to the cafe, this time not to work, but simply to be. I ordered a coffee, found my usual spot, and relaxed, letting the ambient noise wash over me. I pulled out a book, a novel I'd picked up on a whim, something I'd have never taken the time to read before. It was a story about resilience, about rebuilding after loss, and as I read, I found myself drawn into the world of the characters, feeling their struggles, their victories. Just as I was about to leave, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see the woman from the nearby table, the one I'd seen reading here so many times before. She had a warm smile, her eyes bright and friendly. "Hi," she said, her voice soft yet confident. "I just wanted to say I've seen you here a lot, and I thought I'd introduce myself. I'm Rachel." I returned her smile, feeling an unexpected sense of ease. "Derek. Nice to meet you. We exchanged a few pleasantries, talking briefly about our shared love for the cafe, the books we were reading. It was a simple conversation, light and unassuming, but as I walked out, I felt a strange hope flicker within me. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe I was just getting started. In the months that followed, Rachel and I became good friends, then gradually, something more. We met at the cafe a few times a week, often reading side by side or sharing stories about our lives. She had a calmness about her, a quiet warmth that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. With her, I felt at ease, a softness I hadn't felt since before everything fell apart with Claire. But more than that, Rachel was real, a kind of grounded presence that helped me let go of the lingering shadows of my past. Our friendship deepened, but slowly, we ventured past it. She'd laugh at my dry humor, toss a playfully sarcastic remark back, then settle back into her book, content just to be with me. And I was content, too. I hadn't expected it, but life started to feel full again. One chilly evening in late fall, we decided to meet at the cafe before going to a small concert. I had been looking forward to it all week. It was the first time in years that I felt excited, genuinely happy to be with someone who seemed to understand me. The cafe was busy, as usual, and I scanned the crowd, searching for her familiar face. Then I spotted her at our usual table, her brown hair pulled back, her gaze focused on a book. I made my way over, but before I could reach her, I saw someone approach her first. He was tall, with a wiry frame and a tentative smile. I stopped in my tracks, not sure why, but the look on Rachel's face made me pause. She looked up at him, her smile slipping into a look of recognition, then worry. They began to talk, their voices low, and as I stood there, a few feet away, something within me turned cold. I couldn't hear the words, but her expression said enough. She looked up, searching the cafe with quick glances, and when she spotted me, her face froze. "Derek," she said, standing up quickly. This is Paul." I nodded, managing to force a polite smile even as my heart hammered. I'd heard her mention him, briefly, a couple of times, a previous relationship she'd ended over a year ago. He'd left suddenly, she'd said, and she hadn't heard from him since. "Nice to meet you, Paul," I said, shaking his hand and trying to mask the unease churning in my stomach. "Likewise," he replied, glancing between Rachel and me, an awkward silence settling over us. I watched Rachel's face, saw the conflict in her eyes as she looked at Paul, then back at me. Her eyes held an apology, a flicker of something she didn't quite know how to say. We exchanged a few strained words before Paul suggested they step outside to talk. She hesitated, looking at me again, a silent question in her eyes. "Go on," I said, forcing my voice to remain calm. "I'll wait here." She nodded, gave my hand a small, grateful squeeze, and followed him out. I watched them through the window as they spoke on the sidewalk, her face softening as he talked, her hand sometimes drifting up to touch his arm. With each passing minute, my heart sank deeper. I could feel the hope I'd started to build unravel, piece by piece, as I waited, staring out the window like some helpless bystander in a life that had suddenly stopped feeling like my own. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel came back inside. Her face was pale, her hands twisting nervously. She sat down across from me, unable to meet my eyes. "Derek," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to say this." I nodded, the knot in my chest tightening. "Take your time." She let out a shaky breath, clasping her hands together as if searching for the right words. "Paul, he's here to ask me to come back. He wants to try again." I could feel the blood drain from my face, but I kept my expression steady. "And what do you want, Rachel?" She looked down, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her own answer was too heavy to bear. "I don't know. I thought I'd moved on, that I was ready for something new." But seeing him again, she trailed off, finally lifting her gaze to meet mine, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and regret. "I think I need to find out, Derek." I nodded, swallowing the ache that was building in my throat. "I understand," I said quietly, even though I didn't, even though the words felt hollow in my mouth. She reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine. "I didn't want to hurt you. I never meant to." "It's okay," I said, pulling my hand back gently, standing up and looking down at her one last time. "Do what you need to do, Rachel. Just, take care of yourself." I left the cafe before she could say anything else, before she could shatter the thin thread of composure I was clinging to. Outside, the cold air hit me, sharp and unforgiving, matching the rawness inside me. I walked aimlessly, letting the city lights blur around me, the sounds of laughter and conversation fading into background noise. My mind felt numb, a strange emptiness settling in as I tried to process what had just happened. In the days that followed, I threw myself even harder into work, desperate to distract myself. I told myself it was for the best, that if she could leave so easily, she hadn't truly been there to begin with. But the ache remained, stubborn and relentless, no matter how many hours I spent trying to outrun it. One evening, as I was sifting through some files at the office, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel. "I'm so sorry, Derek. I just wanted you to know that I'm thinking of you. I hope you're okay." I stared at the message for a long time, the words blurring as I tried to figure out what to feel. Part of me wanted to respond, to hold on to whatever connection we still had, but I knew better. I couldn't be the one holding on to half of her heart. In the end, I deleted the message, putting my phone away and staring at the empty desk in front of me. I had been down this road before, had fought so hard to rebuild my life after Claire. And now, it felt like I was right back where I started, alone, haunted by the quiet ache of what could have been. A few weeks later, as winter settled in, I returned to the cafe. It was empty, the chairs neatly stacked and the lights dim. I took a seat by the window, watching the snowfall outside, the quiet peace of the world blanketed in white. A sense of finality washed over me, a bittersweet acceptance that perhaps, for all my trying, I was meant to be alone. Maybe this was my fate, a life built on memories of those who couldn't stay, an endless loop of beginnings that never found an end. And as I sat there, watching the snowfall, I realized that sometimes, life doesn't offer second chances or fair endings. Sometimes, all we have are the fragments of what once was, and the strength to keep moving forward, even when the path ahead is empty. The cafe grew colder as the night wore on, but I stayed, letting the silence surround me, a quiet companion in a world that felt just a little lonelier than before.